This is the second episode of the series Decolonizing Design Through Dialogue. This series is possible thanks to the Design History Society, which awarded me the Decolonizing Design History Grant. They also advised me on whom to interview outside of Latin America so that this series could have a more international perspective. This series features interviews and projects from India, Argentina, Spain, Ghana, the USA, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Australia, Ecuador, and Paraguay. It is a trilingual series with episodes in Portuguese, Spanish, and English. I interview designers, artists, and researchers. When I create a series, I also have some questions that I want to ask to all the interviewees in the series. How do you define and understand the concept of decolonizing design? What are the key challenges and opportunities in decolonizing design education and practice? How do your own research practices contribute to decolonizing design? What concrete examples of design projects or initiatives embody decolonial principles? What resources or strategies would you recommend to designers seeking to decolonize their work? I do not do it in a strict orderly way, but I try to ask these questions in this series. Suchitra Balasubramanian is a design researcher from India. We talk about how nationalist ideas are reproduced at the borders between countries. We talk about the border between India and Pakistan. It is to note that we have recorded this interview many weeks before the recent attack on Pakistan. Suchitra tells us about indigenous making practice in India, her link to activism, and how she has tried to incorporate to design education more about Indian reality. My name is Mariana Salgado. This is Diseño y Diáspora.
I studied design in Ahmedabad, in India, in the early 1980s. I belong to an older generation of trained designers in India. I belong to a family in which activism was quite prominent. My mother was active in India's feminist movement. So there is an orientation already in the family towards justice, towards speaking out, and so on. So that has also informed my approach and thinking about design.
In your research, you put design in connection with border studies. So what do you think it could be the contribution of design to borders?
So that was a recent kind of thinking about design and borders. But basically that connects to my interest in places where we can spot the design intent, but not necessary that there are trained designers in that setting. So my work on borders was about how nationalist ideas are produced at the border, the political borders of India, through certain very intentional practices, which I call design. So the intention was not to contribute to border studies as such, but trying to look at design in unlikely places where the outcomes of design are political as well as kind of aesthetic in the way that they talk about nationalism and identity.
And can you give me an example of that?
So, for example, in that essay that I wrote, I was looking at how the Indian government and the Pakistani government have enacted and designed some rituals at our northwestern border in order to produce certain kinds of nationalistic narratives. And at the same time, I contrast that to certain citizen-based initiatives, which are also designerly, which kind of contradict the narrative of the two governments. And it's a more citizen-oriented move for friendship, for collaboration, which is the exact opposite of what the two governments are trying to produce through their design at the borders. So it is kind of contrasting two types of nationalist narratives, one which is competitive and somewhat violent in its imagination, and the other a kind of collaboration, shared cultural context is being looked at. And it's also a site where design is kind of engaging with our colonial past in the present. So, so the persistence of the past is very much a kind of leitmotif in that narrative.
So maybe for the ones that are listening to us, can you tell what happens in this border? What are the type of ceremonies we are talking about?
So, as you know, India and Pakistan were one country till about 70 years ago.
Yes.
And so we have a long shared tradition. We also have a similar colonial past. So the border is a place where certain kinds of spectacles are reproduced every evening when the border actually is closed ceremonially. And both sides, Pakistan and India, they enact certain military type rituals, which also reflect, which are actually accentuated to reflect our not so friendly relations. So it's a very competitive, it uses military clothes, it uses military dramatic gestures in order to set up a very competitive, nationalistic, oppositional kind of aura. And here, the audience is Indian and Pakistani citizens. So the spectacle also communicates a certain type of competitive nationalism to audiences who come all the way from different parts of India, and I presume from different parts of Pakistan, to come and actually view this spectacle. And so it rouses very nationalistic feelings. They are not feelings of friendship. They are competitive. They are aggressive. And that is the tone and tenor of the about an hour-long ceremony. And in contrast to this, once in a year, on August 14th and 15th, on the night of August 14th and 15th, which is our Independence Day, both for India and for Pakistan, there is a citizens' initiative where people come together in a equally performative way with lighted candles, and our borders are not open. So we can stand only on either side of the border and share the candle light and talk of friendship, of building bridges between two sibling countries. So the whole tone and tenor of that occasion at the same site, which is the border, which during the evening would have been a very aggressive kind of performance. At night, it becomes a very gentle, collaborative, peaceful occasion of friendship. So how is this contrast produced through design? I'm arguing that these are both very designed spectacles where the intention is totally contrasting. And what's interesting for me is that there are no trained designers. Nobody has come out of a design school, right? But there are parties who understand how design functions very intuitively, and its rhetorical functions, its persuasive capacity, and so on.
I wanted to ask, because you are positioning these ceremonies, and both of them, the one of the citizens and the one that the government they perform, as design, as this, and why it is important to say, okay, this is the design.
So it didn't happen by chance. There is intentionality. I think one of the key features of design is a very strong intentionality. You want to produce a certain mood, a certain ideological environment. You want people to act on the basis of that environment, that ideology, that mood, right?
Yes.
So I think the training in design schools, especially in the communication programs, is exactly this. Equally so in the industrial design branch of design, where the rhetorical, semiotic power of objects, artifacts, and the sequences in which they are put is part of our training, right?
Yeah.
So I'm also arguing for the fact that design abilities, design sensibilities, design strategizing is also an innate human tendency. And when coupled with power, it becomes quite widespread in its authorial. I mean, design is performed in many separate settings, and one needs to be very attentive to this because there are many competitors out there, and trained designers need to be aware of this, that their roles, functionalities are performed and produced by many actors.
And let's go now to a little bit about to the topic of the colonial design. So, how do you understand the concept of decolonizing design?
So my understanding comes very much from my location. There are 2, 3 things that are of concern to me. One is that it's very difficult to talk of one kind of decolonization in India because maybe some of our listeners may not be aware, but India is the size of Europe without Russia. It's a very huge country with a lot of cultural diversity, with a lot of social diversity and economic diversity, and even political diversity. And so it's the trajectories of historical experience are very different in different parts of our country. Just to underline that while the British presence in India was for 200 years, not all of India was under British administration, but was under British influence. So this also creates a lot of variety in the histories. So one, I hesitate to talk about a single decolonial position. And the second is that within Indian society, there is a lot of hierarchy. You know about our caste system.
Yes.
So there is a historical subjugation of our indigenous populations and of the socially dispossessed in our Hindu hierarchy. So that goes parallelly to the British colonial experience. So this adds to the complication of the situation here. So for example, if I just take a small example of all the different aspects I've spoken on till now, let's take writings on design, which are usually available in my country only in English. So this points to that colonial experience. But we also need to underline that writings on design are not available in any of 26 official languages of my country.
Wow.
So that means the discourse around design, though we have a very rich tradition of craft production, that is not available in any language, but principally in English. So as a result of which, the National Institute of Design, where I studied, which is a government-owned, state-owned design institute, state-run design institute, every state-run institution needs to have a name in our national language, Hindi. Right?
Yeah.
So the National Institute of Design needed to be translated into Hindi, and they could not find a word for design in Hindi. So there is also no word for design in our Indian languages. So this is also a very peculiar or very interesting situation which we need to think about when we think about design in India.
And you are a professor, right? You work as an educator.
Yes.
So how do you take into account this in your teaching?
It's a challenge. I can't say that I have really kind of figured out how to do this. But there are 2-3 things that I like to do. I teach design history to undergraduate students. I also teach a course called Design and Environment, in which students go out into the field and document Indian society and Indian culture and so on. So I try to teach both in an integrated manner so that the present society that we see is also understood historically. So I try to bring historicizing elements into how we look at the present nature of Indian society. My attempts also try to develop parallel Indian design history while we are talking about Euro-American developments. And I also try to talk about the difficulties of historiography in India. So, for example, in doing a history of design in India, we try to become conscious about our own positionality. And usually in design schools, students and teachers belong to the upper social background of our society. So, who can speak for decolonial ways of thinking? This is also a dilemma. I also try to bring examples of how craft communities in India, which are typically in the marginalized sections of Indian social hierarchy, are bearers of our design traditions, but they themselves in Indian society are marginalized. So how with our upper caste, upper class backgrounds do we interrogate without becoming aware of our own positionality? So I take a little political position also in a classroom as gently as I can, and also try to bring it into conversations with colleagues and the larger design fraternity.
So do you also, in these design history classes, do you also design, have a type of action-oriented projects?
No, we don't have an action-oriented project. We have action-oriented project in other courses. So we try to bring in these kinds of perspectives there. But another thing I forgot to mention is our connections to decolonization is not only with the British presence, but the fact that after independence, the inauguration of modern design education took place at the intersection of Cold War politics as well as nation building efforts. So we were caught in the middle of the race between the United States of America and Russia after the Second World War. And it is in those circumstances that design came into India. So we also have to take into account post-colonial global power arrangements, which added an extra layer to the whole British imperial experience. So what I try to do is not do design projects in the history classes, but to do case studies of interesting experiments where these issues come into view.
Yeah, and what are the case studies that you review?
So one is the crafts experiments that are happening at different historical points in India. We start usually with talking about Gandhi and his ideas about the handmade and making by hand. And we talk about Tagore in Eastern India and his efforts to revitalize craft production. And we see this in the context of the arts and crafts movement in Europe and America. And try to compare and contrast these two attitudes, industrialization and hand manufacture, and the kinds of ideologies which are very much rooted in our history. And the second thing we do is trying to look at the inception of design education itself in India and try to look at how the borrowings from the Bauhaus and the Ulm schools of design and Basel for our Zappic design program intersected with nation building ideas of the time. So these are the 2-3 ways in which we try to bring these ideas to students through recent case studies. By recent, I mean post-independence.
Perfect. And what type of analysis do the students do based on these cases?
For many people, it is quite shocking because they've never thought about these issues in this way. They also become aware of how the upper castes and classes of India have appropriated indigenous design and hand manufacture processes. For them, for some more sensitive students, this is also very shocking. They become aware of capitalism and its involvement in design production. For some other students, even this is very shocking. Quite a disruptive process to their very romantic ideas about design.
And could you tell us, for example, some examples of Indian design work that is clearly a decolonial design?
I can point to 2 recent developments. So there is one leather goods design firm. It's called Chamar.com. Just to give you a little background, leather work in the Indian social setting is considered to be highly marginalized. Communities which work with leather historically are considered untouchable. Socially, even today, these kinds of ideas are, if not practiced, at least they are there in the social mindset.
Yeah.
So this group is asserting their marginalized, stigmatized status as leather workers to produce high-end luxury goods. And so they are joining the market with leather products priced at the level of luxury goods. So they're not coming into the market, they're not asserting themselves through a social stigmatized lens, but actually asserting that as identity in order to come in at the top end of the market. So this I see as a double-pronged kind of example of assertion. It's a way to think about indigenous making practices, but not from the position of victimhood or of taking your social position as a given, but asserting it and trying to work in modern markets and in a modern social situation with that very emancipatory approach. So I find this a very radical kind of idea in the design landscape. The second thing I wanted to speak about is the newly formed Tribal Design Forum. So all of India's tribal design practitioners who belong to Adivasi communities or indigenous communities have now started getting together and talking about their cultural traditions and its appropriation within Indian society and asserting their indigenous identities, which also to me is a very radical moment in Indian designs. So these are also the examples that we try to bring into the classroom.
And you have contact with these communities? Have you done any collaboration?
Not with these organizations. I've not done any collaborations, but I had earlier, before I was an educator, I was a practitioner, and my practice was based amongst the formerly untouchable communities and indigenous communities in Western India. So I have many activist links, and I was part of social movements. So I have other kind of, let's say, humanistic and human rights based linkages with these communities, but I don't work now anymore directly with design interventions.
Perfect. And the modern design education was criticized because they train students to create products for European lifestyles. What is going on in India?
It's not really for European lifestyles. I wouldn't use that term anymore. It was true in the early 20th century, where a lot of work was exported for European drawing rooms. But it is certainly much focused on urban Indian home and the urban Indian workplace. So there is a huge orientation on urban India. There's a huge orientation to middle and upper class lifestyles. I think many may not agree with me. My colleagues may or may not agree with me, but this is my impression and my analysis of the impact of design. There is still the nation building ethic and ideology is still present. And so a lot of urban based designers work for rural areas. So you hardly have design practices which are based in rural areas. So it's always the urban which is looking at the rural through its lenses. So that is a second kind of reality. English speaking, modern, educated professionals are also dominating the thinking in the field. So I think there aren't people who have worked on this in relation to design. So I can't point to any literature in the area. And I too have not got around to writing about these things. But yeah, this is my estimation.
But in design and education, there was a lot of influence by Bauhaus and Ulm, as you pointed before. Do you think that now we are moving away from these influences?
Not very substantially. There was a time in the 70s where we tried to develop new curriculum, and I've written about that and about how we tried to move away from Bauhaus and Ulm, at least in our foundation program, which is the first year of undergraduate design studies. But a larger restructuring, conceptual restructuring has not happened. Of course, there have been changes, and it's not as if we have a pristine Bauhaus Ulm curriculum. There are instances in which Indian realities have been incorporated into the curriculum. But more and more, as design practitioners reach out to global markets, there is again a kind of reorientation in design education so that Indian designers or Indian trained designers can find work and be relevant to global markets and global design opportunities. So this is also a tension. The need to be rooted is kind of in conversation with a need to be a sort of quote unquote global citizen or a global professional.
So, and where would you like to see the change, right? Where would you like to go? How we could better teach design history in order to have these new perspectives involved?
I think we should translate into Indian languages and write in Indian languages and translate into English so that there is a two-way knowledge production about design. This is very important. It may also be interesting to you to know that we don't have a single design journal coming out of this big country.
Wow.
There are small, not irregular publications from a couple of design institutions on design. There are commercial um, publications which talk about interior design and new materials and sort of fashion related portals. But there are no academic design journals in India, not one in any language. So, as a result of which, there are a lot of people who are thinking about design in different kinds of settings and different perspectives, but we're not able to gather them in a single voice, right? I'm not saying a journal only has to be printed or something, there could be many, but equally, there are many disparate voices, like the Tribal Design Forum has a very active events list. They have talks by indigenous designers from all over the world. They're trying to build alliances across indigenous practitioners all over the world. So there's many interesting things going on in that forum. So more forums like these are needed. We have a huge population of second only to China, perhaps. So no one thing should be enough or can be enough. So there has to be somebody working on, and I think in different parts of India, and I think now there is a critical mass of professional designers in India, and I think in the next few years we are going to see a lot of local voices coming out from all over India. I think we're just poised to that explosion right now.
This episode is part of the lists India y Diseño, Decolonizar el Diseño, Seguridad y Diseño, D&D in English, y Territorio y Diseño. The titles of the list are in Spanish, but each list contains episodes in English. The D&D in English list includes all the episodes published in English. Over time, we've been building a solid collection, and if this is your first time listening to us, now you know there is plenty more to explore. India is home to nearly 1.46 billion people, making it the most populous country in the world. The country's vast population is spread across regions marked by immense cultural, linguistic, and social diversity. While the constitution in India, for example, recognized 22 official languages at the national level, in reality the number of languages and dialects spoken is far greater. This linguistic richness is often overshadowed in certain professional fields, as for example in design. As Suchitra points out, English-speaking modern educated professionals tend to dominate discourse in the design sector. This is a trend that we want to pay attention. The prevalence of English in professional design spaces can marginalize the voices and perspectives of those working in regional languages, reinforcing existing inequalities. After conducting this interview, I felt inspired to create a series on Indian design that could amplify the voices of those engaged in the colonial practices. While this is currently just an aspiration, I am not one to simply wish for things to happen, but I am committed to make it happen. Let's continue listening to Suchitra, that she has much more to tell us. In 2007, you had a national design policy. And how do you think that this policy protects Indian design from colonial perspectives?
In many ways, I've written very briefly about this. That document of 2007 kind of reproduces colonial voices. It's just in the colonial has been replaced by the nationalistic. So I'm not sure whether it is a real progress towards a very contemporary way of thinking about design, which goes beyond nationalistic rhetoric. So it's all about made in India and designed in India. I find a lot of it is just local nationalism. And now in the last 10 or so years, we've had a kind of return to hyper nationalistic vocabularies, and which is also, rejecting the British colonial experience, but going back in the process to a highly Hindu visualization of Indian society. So, in trying to reclaim a pre-British past, one can be in great danger of flattening out the kind of diversity that we have. The diversity in our populations in terms of religion, in terms of culture, in terms of social practices is too vast to be subsumed under one Hindu umbrella as a reaction to the British presence. So many counter narratives have to be developed so that this flattening out of Indian identity can be, more layered rather than a single kind of reality which is being projected. So that is definitely going to be a challenge in the next few years, and that policy has to be revisited and created in a more broad-based way, where all these voices that I'm talking about, indigenous communities of India or the socially marginalized communities of India, begin to start placing their points of view in that document.
Perfect. And if we want to read and or listen or watch things in relation to these topics and your own research, what would you recommend us? Is there something that
there is one very impressive and striking work which has been done by my colleague Sarita Sundar, which is tracing a history of furniture design through the history of the chair in the subcontinent. So it's called From Frugal to Ornate. It's a very striking and thought-provoking history of the chair in India. I think that's something the listeners would like to explore. There are some writings within the space of social design, which is emerging. There's the work of my colleague Lakshmi Murthy or my colleagues at the Shrishti School of Design. Many of them are working in community-based design initiatives. So that could be something interesting to look at. The websites of the Tribal Design Forum, chamar.com, these are also places to be looking at. Another internet-based resource is a forum called Voice of Fashion. Though it is a fashion kind of magazine, there are many, many articles in it, short pieces, which are talking about alternative ways of looking at Indian design, Indian fashion, Indian textiles, Indian craft. So that could also be a good place. The Museum of Art and Photography based in Bangalore has recently done an excellent series on Indian craft, which has been anchored by Dr. Annapurna Garimella. This is a wonderful resource which it was a 10
Perfect.
episode.
And in the future, where do you want to move your practice? What would you like to be doing?
There are two things I'm working on, which are actually going into different directions. One is I'm writing the biography of a craftsperson. This is a person called Maneklal Gajjar, who was a carver of textile blocks used for block printing on fabrics. So he lived, his life was through the 20th century, and he passed away in 2014. So I'm trying to write what it was like to be a modern Indian craftsman. So that's one thing that I'm working on just now. And the second is I'm writing on how certain kinds of thinking about psychoanalysis in the mid 20th century in India actually informed the structure and culture of the National Institute of Design. Its structure and culture were informed by the psychoanalytic thinking in mid-century Britain and America. And it's a very little known fact about design education in India. So that's something I'm working on.
And how do you know?
Because there is a document called the Structure Culture document, which was written by the first directors of the National Institute of Design. And they quote the psychoanalysts of the Tavistock School in London. And they quote Erik Erikson, who was visiting Ahmedabad in the 1960s. So there is a direct interaction with psychoanalysis, and a psychoanalytic clinic was set up in our city at around the same time, and many famous analysts visited the city. So the main author of this document was somebody who was very interested in psychoanalytic thought, and he applied it to undergraduate education in a very interesting way. So that's how I kind of got introduced to these ideas, and that's I'm trying to pursue this very unusual angle to design education.
And how do you think that psychoanalysis has been informing design education?
Maybe it's not thinking about it in terms of design education, but trying to incorporate it into education itself. And because it happened in the setting of design education, I'm making some further observations. But Erikson was talking about the development of young people against the backdrop of social transformation. And that was exactly what was happening in India in the 1960s. The country was newly independent. There was a huge turmoil in the social and economic and political fabric of this country. And what was happening with young people growing up at this time, and how should education and an educational institution align itself to the developing young mind, whether they are teaching design or anything else. So the document speaks of this, and also recommends certain institutions and processes based on these insights for the functioning of the National Institute of Design. So how does the structure of an organization connect to the culture it wishes to produce? And how does the structure respond to the ambient culture of the society in the context of the development of a young mind? This is what actually the document is trying to do. And it's actually quite an intriguing way of bringing together the design of a design institution.
Well, thank you a lot for the interview. I started to do this podcast mainly because I wanted to reconnect with my ability to talk about design in my mother tongue, Spanish, and to learn from the global south, especially after spending so many years studying in the northern hemisphere. For a long time, I thought I could never podcast in English. The whole idea was to have more interaction with the Spanish speakers. By little, I've started to feel more comfortable interviewing in English. At first, I only did it with my closest colleagues, simply because I wanted the joy of interviewing them. Doing an interview is a very different experience from just talking about our work at a gathering on an event. In an interview, I can really dive deep into the issues that interest me without interruptions and without having to share the conversation with others. At the same time, I used to think, well, there are already so many people podcasting in English, why should I? But over time, I realized that most of those podcasters have different interests, and there actually aren't that many people focusing on social design and design research. So there is a real need for this kind of content. Honestly, I was also a bit embarrassed about my accent. I still struggle with the idea of having podcasts in English, a language I don't really consider my own. It's tough to listen to myself and notice the mistakes I make, or hear my strong Argentinian accent. But lately, I've started to think that feeling ashamed of my English or my accent is actually part of this colonial mindset, the idea that there is only one correct way to speak or express yourself. So I'm trying to push past those colonialized ways of thinking and doing. I want to expand the boundaries of this podcast and amplify voices from other Souths. As always, the music of this podcast is by Antonio Zimmerman. Sound design is by Andy Fecci. This podcast is published with Creative Commons license with attributions. This was Diseño y Diáspora. You can follow us on our social media channels in YouTube, Instagram, LinkedIn, or Blue Sky, or visit our website. Remember to recommend us and recommend our books. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode.